So welcome to this ACUR at ANU student presentation session. I would like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. So I'm personally meeting you from Brisbane, which is Jagera and Turrbal land, country. And I recommend that you acknowledge the same or just learn which country you're standing on. And I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present. So my name is Olivia and I'll be chairing today's session. Our first presenter today is Christine Hill. We also have Peta, Bowler-Bowerman and Shanara, Visvalingam. And our two judges, Mark Nelson and Kate Minlick. Sorry for my pronunciation. So I will probably get straight to it. So our first presenter is Christine. So feel free to start sharing your slides and yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine, and my project is looking at the feasibility and acceptability of a self-regulation and mental imagery program for people with Parkinson's disease. So to start this presentation off, I'd like you to take a moment to think about a task that you did this morning, such as putting on a shirt. Think about what steps you went through to complete that task. Were there any challenges? Did the shirt get stuck on your arm? How did you overcome those challenges? For most of us, our brain usually does the work for us. It knows what to do, when to do it, and quickly solves the problem if things go wrong. We don't need to spend time thinking about what step is next. Today, I'd like to refer to that capacity as our autopilot. This autopilot is the thing that keeps us doing what we need to do with very little conscious thoughts or attention. In Parkinson's disease, however, a loss of dopamine in a specific region of the brain results in this autopilot fading, which can manifest through an attentional deficit. This attentional deficit is seen through many of the motor symptoms people with Parkinson's disease experience, such as slow movements, poor initiation and execution, freezing, a shuffling gait, or poor coordination. And these motor symptoms impact a person with Parkinson's disease capacity to complete everyday activities. Currently, in the management of Parkinson's disease, rehabilitation is often used to complement medication to manage the symptoms of Parkinson's. This study that I'm talking about today recognizes that currently there's a wide range of valuable evidence-based rehabilitation strategies that are used. We have classified them into three categories. First one is task modification, which refers to relearning a task in a new method. The second one is environmental adaptation, such as using equipment or home modifications to assist the person. And then finally, asking for assistance from health professionals or family members. This we have classified as the T approach. While these interventions in the T approach have a good body of evidence to support their use, they focus on addressing the motor symptoms or compensating for these symptoms. Therefore, interventions that rather focus on addressing or compensating for the attentional deficit could be more beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. So two of these attentional strategies include self-regulation and mental imagery. So self-regulation is when a person brings to a conscious level what is required for a task. By doing this, they are then able to self-monitor their progress and identify any problems or difficulties they are experiencing, and then problem solve to overcome these problems by focusing their attention on these issues. Self-regulation is an established rehabilitation technique for people experiencing strokes or brain injuries. The second technique is mental imagery. Mental imagery is when a person mentally imagines every single detail of the actions required to perform a task without even physically moving. It is an attentional strategy that promotes planning and preparation before actually even doing the task. This allows a person to overcome the attentional deficit by using attentional resources before to plan and having excess left over to be able to implement those tasks. Currently, There is no known comprehensive rehabilitation program that combines mental imagery, self-regulation with those current rehabilitation strategies, or the T approach, to improve everyday activity performance in people with Parkinson's disease. So this study aims to investigate the feasibility and acceptability of a newly designed self-regulation and mental imagery program for people with Parkinson's disease. The aim of the program is to enhance the performance of everyday activities, motor function, and cognitive function for people with Parkinson's disease. This study was conducted through a single group pre- and post-intervention study. We recruited a sample of 12 participants who had to be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease of a mild to moderate severity and were screened for intact cognition. This study was conducted at Concord General Repatriation Hospital in Sydney. So the participants then participated in an intervention program. The initial intervention program was designed in collaboration with people with Parkinson's disease, carers, and other health professionals. It was held over 6 weeks at weekly face-to-face sessions at Concord General Repatriation Hospital. The overall process or self-regulation process we taught to the participants can be seen on screen currently. So participants were encouraged to choose a task, or I gave them a task, such as putting on a shirt. We would then break the task down into the different steps. And this allowed the people to bring to a conscious level what was required for the task. Once we'd done that, we would then identify any of those steps that they were having problems or difficulties with, bringing their attention to the specific issue. We then would brainstorm and problem solve possible solutions using the current rehabilitation techniques through the T approach, as well as mental imagery as possible solutions. Mental imagery was then used to try and practice those solutions, as well as some physical practice of those solutions as well. And then we discuss and monitor and adjust accordingly if those solutions were actually benefiting the problems the participants in the groups were experiencing. So we would usually complete this process with 1 to 3 activities per session. In addition to the weekly sessions, participants were also given home programs to do every week and were followed up by a weekly phone call. So what were the results of our study? So 11 participants completed the study with aged between 63 and 85 years old. This intervention program had 1 dropout, unfortunately. Participants were all male, and they all had lived with Parkinson's disease between 1 year and 21 years, with an average of 8 years. We looked at the feasibility of the intervention through looking at attendance rates. So the total session attendance of those 11 participants was 87.88%, with 8 participants completing all sessions. This high face-to-face session attendance shows that the program is feasible. However, the low completion rates of the home programs at 65.45% shows that there needs to be some more improvements and adjustments to the home programs to improve this feasibility. We looked at acceptability through an acceptability questionnaire we administered at the end of the intervention program. From those results, we can see that the duration, schedule, and content were all found acceptable through median results of being agreeable or completely agreeable. The program was also recommended by all participants in the program. Some valuable feedback we received in addition to the questionnaire was that they'd like more face-to-face sessions, and they'd like to improve the clarity of some of the content of the program. Overall, they all reported enjoying interacting with other people who were having the same difficulties as themselves. And finally, the results for the outcome measures. So we conducted a range of outcome measures to determine the effectiveness of the program, as you can see on screen. From our results, we found that the perceived performance of the tasks we addressed in the program was found to be significant. Therefore, this shows that there was limited generalizability beyond the tasks we addressed in the program, which is something we can adjust. However, there was improvement to their performance as a result of the program. Cognition was also shown to be significant, showed a significant improvement. And this specific trial-making test measured the person's attention and flexibility. So therefore, these preliminary results demonstrate that the STREMI-PD program may improve the tasks directly addressed by the program, as well as a person's attention and mental flexibility. The other outcome measures showed no statistical improvement. However, this may be due to the assessments not being sensitive enough, as well as the small sample size. In conclusion, this was the first of its kind of study trialed in Australia and potentially the world. These preliminary results show that the STREMI-PD program is feasible and acceptable for use with people with mild to moderate Parkinson's disease to improve their everyday activity, performance, and cognition. The study also shows that by combining self-regulation, mental imagery, and conventional rehabilitation strategies, people's functional outcomes may improve. Overall, further research into the program and revisions to the program are needed for future.
All right, thank you, Christine. We now have, a silent applause from Kate, but yeah, well done. So we now have 5 minutes for questions for Q&A. So first, I'll go to Kate and Mark to ask if they have any questions. Yep, Mark has raised a hand.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was a great talk for the session, a great start. I was curious as to why all the participants were male, and do you think that's influenced the results?
So there is a lot of research suggesting that Parkinson's disease is more prevalent in males. However, the sample, just because we were using convenience sampling, the people who accepted the invitation to participate in the study ended up being all male. So,
why do you think that people were less likely to complete the tasks if they did them at home?
The clarity of the home programs, I think, was one thing. It took a while for them to understand the concepts at times as well. And also just the nature of home programs generally not being the easiest thing to complete if the motivation isn't there as well.
My final question is, I know you gave a very precise percentage because you said it was 65.45%. What were your grounds for deciding that that was worthy to be quoted to 2 decimal places?
It was just the way I calculated it. I guess that was just what I found was significant. I don't have a full reason for that.
Oh, thanks for answering my questions.
Yeah, I think you very thoroughly answered any question I could have too. I can't think of one. But for future, do you intend, personally, to continue the research, or are you do you think someone else will continue the project?
Self-regulation and mental imagery are subjects my supervisor researched a lot into, and so I see in the future she would probably continue researching the benefits of it.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it sounds like it laid good foundations for future research. So I guess thank you, Christine, for that presentation. We might move on to the next now that it is 1/4 past. So the next presenter on the list is Peta, and feel free to share your slides and start presenting when you're ready.
Thank you. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peta Bowler-Bowerman, and I'm hoping that you have enough coffee in your system to tie you over for another presentation today. My research was conducted at the Cairn Miller Institute under the expertise of Dr. Chris Kilby and focuses on stress, something that we have all experienced and what I ironically am experiencing in this moment. In particular, we looked at whether our perception of stress is influenced by how we treat ourselves, so with compassion or with criticism. To understand this research, we first begin by understanding the transactional model of stress. Maybe being set up on a blind date could be a stressful situation, or giving an oral presentation. And it is the way that we perceive this situation, which we refer to as a stressor appraisal. Primary appraisals represent the perception of challenges or threats, meaning I might approach this presentation as an opportunity to demonstrate my hard work during my honours year. This would constitute a challenge appraisal. Or alternatively, anticipate the internet bottoming out and making a bit of a fool of myself, which would be a threat appraisal. Primary appraisals can be thought of on a single scale, so you can be challenged or threatened, but never both. And when I get to my study later in the presentation, when you see me talking about primary appraisals, I'm referring to this approach. Rather, it can also be measured on two separate scales, so you can find a stressful situation challenging and threatening simultaneously. Secondary appraisals are when you consider the resources you have available to help cope with a stressful situation, such as knowing I had my supervisor in the lead up for advice, and that if this doesn't go to plan, I do have comfort food waiting for me in the pantry. These stressor appraisals then inform how we cope, such as if we try to problem solve or instead catastrophize. And as stressor appraisals influence how we experience and also respond to stress, it's important we understand what influences them so that we can steer away from harmful consequences like cardiovascular disease or depression and move towards more positive outcomes, such as healthy decision-making. From past research, we know that certain personality traits relate to how stressful situations are appraised. In particular, if a person is inclined to overreact or have difficulty managing their emotions, they tend to focus in on the threat. So for us notoriously neurotic psych students, we don't stand that much of a chance when upcoming assignments appear. And this is where we started to consider if how we respond and treat ourselves during stress may also influence these appraisals. Self-compassion is the ability to extend warmth and understanding toward yourself during tough times. It's a valuable tool when people experience stress and is typically considered by three factors: self-kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. So self-kindness would mean that coming up here, I would remind myself that I can do this and I'll be great. Mindfulness would allow me to take a more balanced view, so taking a step back and keeping this presentation in perspective. And common humanity would tell myself that I'm not alone in my nerves today and that other people presenting at ACUR are feeling similarly. Self-compassion promotes adaptive emotion regulation strategies and resilience when facing adversity. And the idea that self-compassion relates to how we perceive stress is supported by one prior study. However, the researchers studied it under a different model of stress and conceptualized stressor appraisals in a different way. Self-criticism, on the other hand, is a tendency to evaluate oneself harshly and scrutinise your flaws and mistakes. Self-criticism can serve two different functions and express itself in three forms in a monologue, if you will. So the purpose of my self-critic today could be to keep myself in check and perform at my very best, or instead because I want to punish myself. And these are known respectively as self-correction and self-persecution. The inadequate self would mean my inner critic says, I'm not good enough to do this presentation, I'm going to fail. Whereas the hated self would more look like, I don't deserve this opportunity. But I may instead reassure myself. So countering this, I could say, I've done public speaking before and I've survived, so it's going to be okay this time as well. And while no study has explored whether self-criticism and stressor appraisals relate, self-criticism is associated with other aspects of the stress response, such as how we regulate our emotions under stress and how we opt to cope. And this all leads to the premise of our study, whether an individual's self-compassion or self-criticism predicts how a standardised stress event is appraised. And in this case, we opted for the stressful situation being an oral presentation at a workplace. We expected people with higher self-compassion and higher reassured self and lower levels of all other aspects of self-criticism to engage in a stronger challenge appraisal, meaning they might think the presentation could lead to a promotion. And we also expected it would lead to a stronger secondary appraisal so that they'd be able to cope. Whereas people with lower self-compassion and reassured self, but higher levels of the other aspects of self-criticism, were hypothesised to engage in threat and primary appraisals. So they perceived greater risks in the presentation, like being fired or scrutinised. We targeted a general population sample, which we recruited from online platforms such as Facebook. After providing consent, participants self-reported their demographic information and answered how stressed they felt, which we call momentary stress. Self-compassion was measured using the self-compassion scale, and self-criticism by the forms of criticising and reassuring scale, and the functions of self-criticising / attacking scale. Participants read a scenario about preparing for a workplace presentation that might lead to a promotion, and then answered how stressed they felt and the cognitive and stress appraisal scales from that perspective. Our sample consisted of 193 participants, majority of which were living in America, female, around their early 30s, and at an undergraduate level of their education, and most had no mental health diagnoses. Considering today's stressful climate, we did collect information about how COVID-19 affected the participant directly, like being tested or loss of income. We also measured indirectly, so if someone close to them had been diagnosed, for example. Momentary stress at baseline was significantly lower than the perceived stressfulness of the vignette, meaning that I'm not alone, and a lot of people find oral presentations rather stressful themselves. And the presenter demographics reported significant relationships with the corresponding stressor appraisals, and therefore were controlled for in later analyses as covariates, but we didn't analyse them further as they weren't relevant to the study's aim. Greater self-compassion, self-correction, and reassured self predicted stronger challenge appraisals, meaning more of these traits increased the perception of challenging and rewarding elements of the presentation. This was expected for self-compassion and self-reassuring because they both offer a caring approach. So that might incline the person to think that they can reap the rewards of the potential challenges. Self-correction's influence was surprising, however, and maybe because this function of self-criticism is scoping out ways to improve and avoid making mistakes. So it increases focus on the rewards as a possible incentive. Whereas challenge appraisals are not impacted by more negative self-talk, like the inadequate self or hated self, no matter how much of the self-criticism occurs. Higher threat appraisals and primary appraisals were both significantly predicted by greater inadequate self and lower hated self. This may be because if the inadequate self anticipates a more significant threat in failing, so they could think that if they fail, then they will be a failure. Whereas the hated self may not be as bothered or invested because they are already sitting there thinking that they are a failure. And what this tells us is that it's the negative content of our self-talk that relates to how threatening we perceive a stressful situation rather than the reason for the negative self-talk. And further, since levels of self-compassion and reassured self did not relate to threat appraisals, the caring and balanced view that these traits offer may circumvent engaging in the losses. Finally, greater reassured self and lower self-persecution predicted stronger secondary appraisals. It makes sense that by focusing on your own strengths and what you can do, which is what the reassured self does, means we consider ourselves more able to cope. Whereas by punishing ourselves for our shortcomings, there's more of a focus on what one lacks and therefore consider themselves less able to cope. So this might be why less of the self-persecution increases secondary appraisals. Theoretically, these results build on the transactional model of stress by identifying new personality traits that relate to stressor appraisals. The study also reaffirms that although self-compassion and self-criticism have been accused of being direct opposites, they are in fact distinct constructs as they contribute uniquely to stressor appraisals. And on a practical level, this study hopes to encourage further research into how incorporating self-compassion and self-criticism as techniques in intervention strategies may influence appraisals of stress to gear them towards more adaptive outcomes. Thank you for listening, everyone. Now the next wave of stress for question time, but thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that talk. And you're right, question time. So might hear from Kate and Mark if you have any questions first. Yep, Kate.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting presentation and really well presented. Well done. I was just curious, you mentioned that you had factored in for COVID into your data collection. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what you found with regard to the differences between COVID-19 or in our current situation.
So we analysed COVID-19 with regard particularly to how momentary stress, so we measured it at time 1 and time 2 before and after the scenario, and whether the kind of natural stress that's arising with COVID also changed the increase or decrease of momentary stress levels. And we found it wasn't actually related to, so it still had the same trend, but I believe and we didn't conduct information about pre-COVID-19, so it's hard to tell whether it did inflate momentary stress levels or not, but we did think that momentary stress was a little bit higher than what we potentially expected, being around 6 out of 0 to 10. And it was quite a scattered response in terms of people that opted they weren't affected in any way by COVID-19. And we had other responses, such as they'd known someone that passed, but a lot of people had either known or been tested themselves and knew or had COVID-19 or knew someone that had COVID-19. And yeah, it was interesting, particularly since a large majority of our population was based in the United States of America.
Has that cut out for only me? No. Okay.
No, it cut out for me as well.
Weird. I might just wait another minute because I want to deprive Peter of a few more minutes of question time. They might cut out and dip back in. Yes, I think we'll just enjoy 30 seconds of silence while we wait to see if they reconnect. Or maybe I have something to say before the silence. I'm not sure. Oh, Peter has gone. All right. Well, we might come back at the end of the session for 3 more minutes of question time. But until then, Shanara, you are up 3 minutes early. Please feel free to share your slides and begin when you're ready.
Great, thanks Olivia. So hi everyone, my name is Shanara and today I'll be presenting the results of a research project which aimed to develop and test the feasibility of an online educational intervention to help students manage their perfectionism. So perfectionism is characterized by the pursuit of high standards accompanied by critical evaluation of the self and others. Although this construct has been measured in several ways, our research project focused on Hewitt and colleagues' conceptualization of perfectionism, which describes 3 different facets. So the first is self-oriented perfectionism, which is focused on self-imposed high standards for oneself. So for example, I strive to be as perfect as I can be. The second is other-oriented perfectionism, which is focused on imposing high standards on others. For example, if I ask someone to do something, I expect it to be done flawlessly. And the third is socially prescribed perfectionism, which involves the belief that others impose high standards for oneself. For example, the people around me to expect me to succeed at everything I do. So how relevant is perfectionism to university students? So Curran and Hill published a cross-temporal meta-analysis in 2017, which examined whether there was an increase in perfectionism in university students over 27 years. The authors found that perfectionism has linearly increased. Socially prescribed perfectionism has increased by 32%, whilst other-oriented perfectionism has increased by 16%, and self-oriented perfectionism by 10%. The authors concluded that recent generations of university students perceive that others are more demanding of them, are more demanding of others, and are more demanding of themselves. These findings are of particular concern because decades of research suggest that perfectionism is a risk factor across multiple psychological conditions, such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, bipolar disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, personality disorders, and eating disorders. In addition, perfectionism contributes to poor academic outcomes, such as poor academic performance, burnout, procrastination, test anxiety, lower engagement, and satisfaction. The perfectionism social disconnection model aims to describe how perfectionistic traits leads to psychological distress, dysfunction, and disorder over time. The model describes two pathways. The first pathway suggests that individuals with perfectionism exhibit interpersonal hostility or inappropriate social responses, such as overt or subtle aggression, coldness, or aloofness. The second pathway suggests that individuals with perfectionism are rejection sensitive in that they interpret the behaviours of others as indicative of a lack of acceptance and perceive the judgments of others as critical. According to the model, both hostile interpersonal behaviours and rejection sensitivity lead to perceived or actual social disconnection, which in turn leads to psychological distress, dysfunction, and disorder over time. Despite 1 in 3 university students meeting criteria for a psychological disorder, research suggests that university students rarely seek or receive psychological treatment, often citing time and financial constraints as the main barriers. In addition, existing treatments for perfectionism also often involve 8 or more 1-hour sessions delivered weekly, which may hinder time-poor and financially strapped students from accessing them. As such, there appears to be a need for a brief, effective, affordable intervention that helps university students to manage their perfectionism. This online program, named the Intentional Imperfection Program, was developed by myself and an honours student in conjunction with our supervisor, who is a clinical psychologist. The materials and resources within the program are original and were developed specifically for the current research. There were 6 learning modules structured to address the specific components of the model, and each was accompanied by a corresponding worksheet. The program took approximately 2 hours to complete and contained a workbook and homework sheets. Each module began with a short educational video providing descriptive information about the construct of interest, along with common examples of each. Management skills taught within the modules included mindfulness, self-compassion, meditation, distress tolerance, social skills training, and ways to strengthen existing social connections. To test the feasibility of the educational intervention, we used the first-year psychology pool and pre-screened 1,099 students for high levels of perfectionism. Of these students, 451 reported moderate to extreme levels of perfectionism and were invited to participate in the study. 70 participants then completed the study. These 70 participants completed measures of constructs related to the model at baseline and then completed the educational intervention. After 2 weeks, participants were then sent the same measures at baseline in addition to a feedback survey to evaluate the program. Our analyses of the data showed small significant reductions in self-oriented perfectionism and socially prescribed perfectionism after completing the educational intervention. However, other-oriented perfectionism did not appear to change. In addition, we found moderate significant reductions in depression and hostility. We also found a small significant reduction in anxiety symptoms. Further, we found a small significant decrease in rejection sensitivity and a small significant increase in perceived social support. However, we did not find any changes in received social support. Our analyses of the quantitative data from the feedback survey showed that 96.8% of participants found the content either very or quite understandable. In addition, 91.9% of participants found the level of instruction given in the program to be very or quite instructive. However, there were mixed results regarding the mode of delivery and length of resource. For example, 33.9% of participants found the mode of delivery to be not effective, a little effective, or somewhat effective, suggesting that the platform that we used may not have been as user-friendly as we would have liked it to be. In addition, 64.5% of participants reported that the program was much or a bit too long, despite the program being considerably shorter than existing interventions for perfectionism. So overall, we observed small to moderate reductions in socially prescribed perfectionism, self-oriented perfectionism, depression, anxiety, hostility, and rejection sensitivity. These findings are promising, particularly when considered against the results of existing perfectionism interventions. For instance, we found that completion of the educational intervention yielded changes on 2 facets of perfectionism. However, the model states that perfectionism is a stable trait and that reductions in perfectionism may require longer and more intensive treatments. Numerous studies indicate that existing perfectionism interventions can reduce perfectionism to a small extent and have identified socially prescribed perfectionism to be particularly resistant to treatment. However, our findings showed that the intervention was associated with small reductions in both socially prescribed and self-oriented perfectionism. In addition, the changes in depression and anxiety observed in this study is comparable to other pre-post changes in psychological distress achieved by much longer perfectionism interventions ranging from 8 to 12 sessions. For example, 2 previous meta-analyses examining the efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy for perfectionism also reported moderate decreases in depression and small decreases in anxiety. However, given that this is a feasibility study that did not directly compare outcomes to a longer intervention, further research is needed to confirm this. Furthermore, we also observed a small increase in perceived social support, but we did not see any changes in received social support. A possible explanation may be that participants were required to engage in physical distancing measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 while participating in this study, and therefore they had limited opportunities to practice the recommended strategies. Further changes in received social support may take longer than 2 weeks to achieve. As such, further research is needed to clarify whether the educational intervention can increase received social support in a non-pandemic context. We also did not find any changes in other-oriented perfectionism. A possible explanation for this is that the educational intervention inadvertently placed more attention on the other facets of perfectionism. In the current version, only the section on interpersonal hostility was specifically designed to target problematic behaviours associated with other-oriented perfectionism. Therefore, changes in this facet may be possible if future iterations of the educational intervention devotes more attention to it. Nevertheless, our feasibility study showed promise, and thus we concluded that a randomized control trial is warranted to further test the efficacy of the educational intervention in helping university students manage their perfectionism.
All right, thank you for that talk, Shanara. And I think the sheer numbers, I was at 451 out of 1099 speaks volumes to how widespread this issue is, and I think particularly in research. So I'll take questions from Kate and Mark, the judges now. If you have any. Yes, Mark.
I was very interested in the survey that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation when you said that it had been found that over the last 40 years, there's been an increase in perfectionism amongst uni students. Do you think that this is an increase just amongst students coming to uni, or is it a wider increase in people in society?
So there has been research, not from that paper, but from a different paper more recently that shows that university students have higher levels of perfectionism and higher levels of distress compared to their non-university counterparts, so people in the community of the same age but who do not attend university. In addition, this paper also hypothesized that the economy and increased demands in university and how the culture of jobs has changed in Western society over time might be leading individuals to adopt more perfectionistic traits over the years.
Thank you. My final question is, if this program is developed, how would you see it being used by universities? Would it be something that all students would be made to do? Would universities sample students to say, oh, you should do this program? Or would it be left for students to decide themselves, oh, this would be a good program for me to do?
Great. So research has also shown us that for online educational interventions, it's best to give in to individuals who have been pre-screened for higher levels of perfectionism, and that's when we're going to see the most effectiveness for them and the most use for them. So in my imagination, for the future, I hope that we would see some sort of screening tool for students, and then they could be referred to the program if they'd like to participate.
If you pre-screen all first-year students and then you say to some of them you might benefit from this program, do you think there's a danger that they'll be stigmatized because the university says you've got problems in your perfectionism?
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think it would necessarily be to all first year students. I know with Macquarie, with our Wellbeing hub, we have an online portal which students can put in what issues that they're struggling with. And they go through a survey system, and then that allocates them to the best intervention possible for them. So we've been talking to the university about possibly getting a future iteration of this onto that website there.
Thanks for answering my questions.
Thanks.
Excellent. So I can't see any Q&A from the audience. So I might now have the next couple minutes if Mark and Kate had any other questions for Peter. But I was probably muted for that. But thank you, Shanara. Really insightful talk. Very well presented.
Apologies, everyone, for my internet dropout. It's a bit of a climate. There's online Zoom calls. It's always bound to happen.
Yeah, did Kate or Mark, did you have any more questions? I think Mark did, yep.
First of all, let me say that a project on the stress of giving the talk was obviously an amusing topic to be giving a talk about.
Yeah.
So I think that worked well for you. I was wondering if you think that by selecting your participants through Facebook, you're self-selecting for certain personality types, which may then influence your results.
Yes, but we also did sample. So Facebook was one of the online platforms that we used. I also was on, I think it's like Reddit pages and social psychology, like network research groups, to try and sample, not just in, of course, like my circle of connections or anything like that. So it was within the school and different online platforms as well to try and get that diversity.
And in that case, did you consider analysing your data based upon the platform that you recruited the participants from to see if there was any difference in that respect?
That's a really interesting question. No, we didn't consider analysing it based on the platform because it all went through. There might be a way, a bit more tech savvy way to go in to how it got. The participant got sampled, but it all kind of went to the one URL and came as an accumulation of participants rather than saying they used it through the Facebook site or the research platform site. So I wouldn't sure.
I don't know if this is an urban legend or not, but I mean, I did read once that a few years ago there was a survey in the UK and people were asked, what are you frightened of? And dying was only number 2 on the list, because the most popular fear was the fear of public speaking.
You know what's quite funny? I almost included that in my slideshow. I heard that from Seinfeld though, so less esteemed. But yes, I've seen that as well. Dying comes second after an oral presentation, so we're all doing quite well today.
All right, well then I think that brings us to the end of today's session. So I just want to thank our judges, so Dr. Mark Nelson and Kate Minley. And congratulations to the student presenters. So this recording will be made available online following the conference. And I hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. But yeah, thank you.